Imagine a city where no one is prepared for a tragedy. People wake up in the morning, go to work, open their shops, meet with friends, and believe that tomorrow will be just like today. And then one day, dead rats begin appearing on the streets. At first, it seems like nothing more than unpleasant accident. Someone notices one rat, someone else notices several. People get annoyed, they talk about it, but no one thinks that they are witnessing the first sign of a catastrophe that will soon change the life of an entire city. This is how one of the most famous novels of the 20th century begins, The Plague by Albert Camus. But the most frightening part of the story is not the disease itself. The most frightening part is how people react on it. When a threat appears that cannot be immediately understood, most people prefer to believe that nothing serious is happening. It is much easier to find an ordinary explanation than to accept that the familiar order of life can collapse at any moment. The city of Oran continues living as if nothing unusual has happened. People go about the daily routines, make plans, refuse to notice their warning signs. But Dr. Bernard Rieux sees what is happening differently. He's the first to understand that the problem is much more serious than it appears. Causes of illness begin appearing one after another, and what first looked like a strange coincidence gradually turns into a real threat. Soon the people of Oran will discover that their city no longer belongs only to them. It will be cut off from the outside world. People will be separated from their loved ones, stripped of their usual freedom, and forced to face uncertainty every single day. But before that happens, the city must go through the most dangerous stage of any disaster, the moment of denial. The moment when people still hope that everything will simply disappear on its own. This is where the real story of the plague begins. This is not just a novel about an epidemic, it's a story about how people behave when their familiar world collapses, when fear becomes part of everyday life, and when every choice reveals who they truly are. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends. By doing this, you are not only helping the channel grow, but also sharing something meaningful with others. You are watching Rambert Books channel. Let's begin! Albert Camus began working on the plague during Second World War, and this had a major influence on the idea behind the novel. At that time, Europe was experiencing one of the darkest periods in its history: occupation, violence, and constant fear. It was during those years that Camus began thinking about how people behave when faced with a common tragedy. At first, the novel was not intended to be simply a story about an epidemic. Camus wanted to show how ordinary people change when the familiar order of life collapses. Some people try to deny the danger, some think only about themselves, while others continue fighting even when they understand how difficult the situation is. The work on the book took several years, and Camus rewrote the novel many times, trying to make it not only a story about disease, but also a reflection on human choices, responsibility, and solidarity. The Plague was published in 1947 and quickly became one of the writer's most famous works. Many readers saw the epidemic as a symbol of the Nazi occupation and of any form of evil that can suddenly appear in society. But the true meaning of the novel was much broader. Camus showed that the real test of a person does not begin when everything is going well. It begins when the world around them starts falling apart. It is in those moments that we see who is ready to fight, who gives up, and who manages to preserve their humanity. A city that did not believe in its own disaster. The city of Oran lived in ordinary life. It was a French city on the coast of Algeria where people went about their daily routines, worked, traded, met each other, and rarely thought about anything beyond their everyday concerns. From the very beginning, Albert Camus shows an important characteristic of this place. Oran is a city of people who are used to living according to a schedule. They value order, money, and their familiar way of life. No one expects that very soon all of this will disappear. The first signs of disaster appears almost unnoticed. One morning, Dr. Bernard Rieux leaves his home and notices a dead rat on the staircase. At first, it seems strange, but nothing more than that. However, it soon becomes clear that this is not an isolated incident. More and more rats begin appearing. They are found in different parts of the city, and the number of dead animals quickly increases. For the people of Oran, this is unpleasant, but it is not yet frightening. They discuss what is happening, they are surprised, they shocked, complain, but most of them do not see it as a real threat. They try to find simple explanations. Some believe it will end soon, others blame the city services, some simply choose not to pay attention at all. But Dr. Rieux sees the situation differently. He is used to observing the symptoms of disease, and he understands that what is happening looks unusual. Soon he encounters the first sick people. They develop high fever, extreme weakness, and other dangerous symptoms. The illness progresses quickly, and Rieux begins to suspect that the city is facing something far more serious. However, accepting this truth is difficult not only for ordinary citizens, but also for the authorities. No one wants to make a decision that could change the life of the entire city. It is too frightening to admit that they are facing an epidemic. Camus shows this moment with great accuracy. The first reaction of people when facing a disaster is denial. Until the danger becomes impossible to ignore, most people try to preserve the illusion of normal life. But the situation worsens every day. The number of sick people grows, and doctors understand that these are no longer random illness, but the beginning of a major disaster. Rieux tries to push authorities into action because he understands one thing clearly: time is working against them. This is where the main conflict of the novel begins. It's not only a battle between humans and disease, it's also a battle against the human desire not to see the truth. While some people try to convince themselves that nothing serious is happening, the disease continues to spread. The city that only yesterday lived an ordinary life is slowly moving toward the moment when pretending that everything is under control will no longer be possible. The people of Oran still do not know what awaits them: isolation, fear, and months of struggle. They do not yet understand that a few death threats were the first warning of an event that will forever change the city. The city is closed. No one can leave anymore. The hardest decision is made when it becomes clear that the spread of the disease can no longer be stopped by ordinary measures. The authorities close Oran. All entrances and exits are blocked. The city becomes completely cut off from the outside world. For the residents, this comes as a real shock. Just yesterday, they could live freely, meet their loved ones, travel to another city, like or simply change their plans if they want so. Now, all of that disappears with a single decision. People find themselves trapped inside a place they once considered their normal home. Now it's become looks more as a prison. But the most painful consequences of the quarantine is not only the fear of the disease. Thousands of people suddenly find themselves separated from those who are outside Oran. Some did not have time to say goodbye to their families. Some were separated from the person they loved. Some believed the separation would last only a few days, but gradually they realized the truth. No one knows when it will end. This is where Camus reveals one of the strongest aspects of the novel. Not the epidemic itself, but human loneliness. People begin living in a state of waiting. They wait for letters, for news, for end of the quarantine, but contact with the outside world becomes more and more difficult. Letters are restricted because authorities fear the spread of the disease. Telephone communication is not available for everyone and quickly becomes overloaded. The ordinary ways of staying connected that once seemed natural have now become a rare chance to feel that you are still connected to your previous life. Every person experiences this situation in their own way. Some try to convince themselves that everything will end soon. They continue with their usual routines, almost refusing to accept the new reality. Others begin to understand the scale of the tragedy and become overwhelmed by anxiety. Some try to find ways to adapt the new conditions. Dr. Rieux, for example, continues his work, but his struggle becomes even harder. He sees not only the suffering of sick people, but also the consequences of isolation. The plague destroys not only health, it destroys the connections between people. The hardest situation belongs to those who have been separated from their loved ones. For them, every day becomes a weight filled with uncertainty. They do not know what is happening to the people they care about, and they have no way to change anything. They even can be sure they stay alive till tomorrow. But gradually, the people of Oran begin to understand one terrifying truth. Quarantine has changed not only their freedoms, but also their perception of time itself. The days start to look the same. People stop living for the future and begin existing only in the present moment. The city continues to function, shops remain open, people walk through the streets, but something inside has changed forever. Oran is no longer an ordinary city. It has become a place where every person must face one question. How do you preserve yourself when the world you knew has disappeared? And this is the moment when the real test of people begins, because now the plague is not only testing their bodies, it is testing their character. How people begin to break down in isolation. Isolation slowly begins to change the people of Oran. In the first days, many still hope it's just temporary. It will end quickly. They wait for news, count the weeks, and convince themselves that soon they will be able to return to their old lives. But time passes and nothing changes. The city remains closed, the disease continues, and the hardest battle becomes not only physical but psychological. Camus shows that the plague does not only affect people's bodies, it changes the way they look at life, at others, and even at themselves. The residents of city begin to understand that they no longer control their own future. They cannot make normal plans, they cannot travel freely, and they can't simply see the people who remain outside the city. Gradually, a feeling of endless waiting takes over. People seem trapped between the past and the future. They constantly remember the time before the epidemic when life felt simple and predictable. They remember meetings, trips, ordinary conversations that they once took for granted. Now those simple things becomes almost impossible. The hardest situation belongs to those who have been separated, as we already said, from their loved ones. They begin living through memories and hope for return for their previous lives, but the longer the quarantine lasts, the stronger the feeling becomes that the past is slow slipping away. Even people's perception of time begins to change. The days start to look the same. At first, people follow every report about the number of infections and death, but gradually, even those numbers begin to feel like part of everyday life. What once caused fear becomes something that are forced to accept. However, isolation reveals not only human weakness, but also different sides of human nature. Some people try to adapt and create a new rhythm of life. They continue working, helping others, and doing what they must. These people become the true strengths of the city, even though they do not consider themselves heroes. Dr. Rieux remains one of the clearest examples of real courage. But his heroism is different from the traditional image of a hero. He does not perform one great action that changes everything. He simply goes to the sick every day, treats them, and continues walking even though he understands that the disease may be stronger than his efforts. Rieux does not believe in grand words and he doesn't see himself as a savior. For him, fighting the plague is a matter of personal honesty. If he's a doctor, then he must treat people. There are other important figures in the novel, such as Jean Tarrou. Unlike Dr. Rieux, he is not connected to the city by professional duty. Tarrou is a newcomer who arrived in Oran shortly before the epidemic began. He carefully observes people and gradually becomes one of the most active participants in the fight against the plague. It is Tarrou who suggests creating volunteer sanitation groups to help the doctors. He represents the idea that even in the face of enormous suffering, a person must preserve their humanity. But not everyone chooses to help others. The plague becomes not only a medical crisis, but also a moral test. In a situation of fear and uncertainty, different sides of human nature appear: selfishness, indifference, fear, but also courage and solidarity. Another important perspective is represented by Father Paneloux, a priest who initially sees the plague as a punishment for human sins. In his first sermon, he tells the people of Oran that the disaster is a trial they must accept. However, as events continue, his own beliefs begin to change. Facing real suffering forces him to question his understanding of evil and how a person should respond to the pain of others. The people of Oran gradually begin to understand that their personal problems no longer exist separately from the suffering of the entire city. The disease affects everyone, but it does not transform everyone in the same way. Some people discover compassion and responsibility, others see an opportunity. Cottard is one of the most complicated characters in the novel and represents the darker side of human behavior. At the beginning of the story, he attempts to take his own life, but after the outbreak of the epidemic, his situation unexpectedly changes. While most people suffer from restrictions, fear, and uncertainty, Cottard benefits from the chaos. He becomes involved in illegal trade and smuggling, which grow during the isolation of the city. For him, the plague is not only a disaster, it's also an opportunity. While others lose their freedom, he finds a way to use the situation for his own advantage. Meanwhile, Dr. Rieux continues his work even though he understands that the struggle may last a long time. He doesn't create illusions and does not promise people an easy victory. His belief is simple: a person must do what is necessary, even when success is not guaranteed. This becomes one of Camus' main ideas. People cannot always control the circumstances they face, but they can choose how they respond to those circumstances. Another important character is the journalist Raymond Rambert. At first, he thinks only about one thing: escaping Oran and returning to the woman he loves, who is outside the city. He sees himself as an outsider and doesn't believe he is obligated to take part in someone else's tragedy. His real life in his mind exists somewhere beyond the walls of Oran. But gradually his attitude changed. He realized that it's impossible to remain separate while other people are suffering. He has the chance to escape, but eventually chooses to stay and help. In this way, the characters of the plaque represent different answers to the same question. What should a person do when the world around them begins to collapse? Rieux chooses duty, Tarrou chooses solidarity, Paneloux goes through an internal struggle, Cottard tried to use chance, chaos for personal gain, and Rambert must decide whether his own happiness is more important than responsibility toward others. But the people of Oran are still facing the greatest challenge. The plague continues to spread, the number of victims grows, and despair becomes stronger. At this moment, that it becomes clearer who is truly ready to fight the disaster and who will break under its pressure. The most devastating scene in the novel, the death of a child. The most painful moment in the entire novel is the death of Judge Otton's young son. This is the point where the priest and this is the moment where the plague stops being simply a story about fighting an epidemic and becomes a profound test for all of the main characters. Before this moment, many people could still see the situation as a battle against a disease, a problem that could be solved with enough doctors, medicine, and effort. But this scene forces them to confront a question that has no simple answer. Why do innocent people suffer? The child becomes infected with the plague and the doctors try to save him. Dr. Rieux and his assistants do everything they can, but the disease proves stronger. For everyone present, this becomes a moment of true shock. They are no longer witnessing just another victim of the epidemic. They are witnessing the suffering of someone who did nothing to deserve such a fate. This scene becomes especially important for Father Paneloux. Earlier, the priest had explained the plague as a trial and a punishment that people had to accept. But witnessing the suffering of a child changes his perspective. In the face of innocent suffering, his previous simple explanations no longer seems convincing. After the child's death, his certainty is shaken by questions he cannot easily answer. He can no longer speak so confidently about punishment and justice when he sees the suffering of an innocent person. His internal struggle shows how difficult it is for a person to hold on to all beliefs when reality destroys the explanation they once depend on. Dr. Rieux reacts differently. He doesn't try to find a philosophical explanation for what is happening. For him, the most important thing is to fight the disease and help people even when he understands that sometimes it will not be enough. This is what reveals his true character. He does not promise what is impossible, but he also refuses to abandon his responsibility. This scene also becomes a turning point for Jean Tarrou. He finally understands that the fight against the plague is not only a medical struggle, it's a fight against suffering itself. Suffering that cannot simply be accepted as something unavoidable. After this moment, the characters can no longer look at the epidemic in the same way. The plague shows them that when faced with real evil, people cannot hide behind simple answers. They cannot just say that everything happens for a reason and continue living as before. They have to choose how they will act. This is where the central conflict of Camus' novel becomes clear. A person may not have control over the hardships that enter their life, but they do have control over how they respond to them. They can turn away, they can search for excuses, they can think only about themselves, or they can remain beside those who need help. The death of the child becomes the most painful point of this story, not only because of the tragedy itself, but because it destroys the last attempts to explain the disaster with simple answers. After this moment, the characters are left with only one question: what should a person do when they understand that evil cannot be completely defeated? And each of them must find their own answer. The end of the epidemic and the main meaning of the novel. Gradually, the situation in Oran begins to change. After many months of fear, death, struggle, the number of infected people starts to decline. What once seemed impossible finally happens. The plague begins to disappear. Hope returns to the city. People start thinking about the future again, and for the first time in a long while, allow themselves to believe that their old lives might return. But Camus does not turn the end of the epidemic into a simple happy ending. The victory over the disease does not erase what happened. Too many people have died. Too many families have lost their loved ones. Too many people have been changed forever by those months of suffering. For Dr. Rieux, the end of the plague is not a moment of triumph also. He does not see it's a final victory. He knows too well how much suffering he has witnessed and how many people he was unable to save. And he understands the most important thing: the plague never truly disappears forever. What makes it even more tragic is that while Rieux spent all this time fighting in the disease, saving others, and fulfilling his duty, he was also facing a devastating personal loss. His wife, who had left Oran for medical treatment before the epidemic began, dies far away from him. Rieux learns about her death after the city has already begun to emerge from the plague. This news becomes one of the most tragic moments in the novel because the man who helped countless others survive the disaster is completely powerless in the face of his own personal pain. Camus shows that even victory over a great evil cannot bring back everything that has been lost. You can save many lives, but you can undo every tragedy. One of the most tragic events in the final pages of the novel is the fate of Jean Tarrou. After everything he has done for the city, when it seems that the danger is finally ending, he himself becomes infected. This is especially painful for Rieux because Tarrou was not simply a helper in the fight against the epidemic. He was someone who shared his beliefs and understood the true meaning of the struggle. Tarrou's death becomes a reminder that even the strongest and most dedicated people do not always receive a reward for their actions. He devoted himself to helping others, but he still became a victim of the disease. Meanwhile, the city slowly begins returning to life. The gates of Oran open, and people can finally leave the city and reunite with those they lost during the quarantine. For many, this becomes a moment of enormous happiness. After months of separation, they finally have chance to regain what seemed lost forever. But the ending is not happy for everyone. Cottard, who became comfortable in the chaos and benefited from the suffering of others, cannot accept the return of normal life. The world where he felt secure disappears together with the epidemic. At the end of the novel, Camus reveals the main idea through Dr. Rieux. He writes, the story of a He writes the chronicle of the plague, and not simply to tell the story of an unusual event, but to preserve the memory of the people who fought the disaster and refused to let it destroy their humanity. The main message of the novel is that evil never disappears completely. The plague may leave, but it can return again. And this applies not only to disease, but to any destructive force capable of spreading through society. That is why the true victory in the novel is not that people managed to destroy the plague. They did not defeat it forever. The victory was different. They did not allow it to turn them into indifferent people. Rieux, Tarrou, and other volunteers were not perfect. They were afraid, doubt, became exhausted, but they continued doing what they believed was right. And this is the main meaning of Albert Camus' The Plague. A person cannot always control the circumstances they face. They cannot always stop a tragedy of chance the entire world or change the entire world, but they can choose who they remain in the middle of the tragedy. They can close their eyes, they can think only about themselves, they can use the suffering of others for their own benefit, or they can continue doing their duty, helping others, and preserving their humanity, even when it seems that there is no hope left. That is why The Plague remains not only a novel about an epidemic, it's a story about human choices in the face of evil. A story about how the real battle is fought not only against an external enemy, but also within every one of us. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching and see you in next episodes. Goodbye.